Shalom, and welcome to lesson number 7 of Secrets of the Forgotten Prophetic Scriptures 101. How did you feel about the dream vision that Baruch received in chapters 36 through 40? Fascinated? Confused? Enlightened? Maybe a little of each? If I do my job correctly, then by the end of this lecture, you'll understand the vision well, and you'll also know who the antagonist is, by name. Hopefully you've already figured out who the protagonist is. It's Yeshua. The antagonist is, well, his evil counterpart. This vision that Baruch receives while sleeping in the ruins of the holy place is very helpful in the way that it affirms end-time prophecies found throughout the Tanakh. I'll point out those parallels as we go. This is the setting of the dream vision, a vast plain encircled by lofty mountains. Much of the plain is covered by a forest. There's nothing particularly noteworthy about this environment, besides perhaps the description of the mountains being rugged and rocky. Then Baruch points to something very strange. A grapevine positioned up against the terrain hovers over it and sends forth a calmly flowing stream of water onto the plain. As that peaceful water reaches the forest, however, it becomes a torrent that levels the trees of the forest and then even wears down the mountains. All the trees are rooted out, save one cedar tree. Rooted out is a phrase that is constantly used in the Talmud with reference to the future fate of Rome. That's very prophetic, as we'll soon discover. The conquering vine comes and takes his place where the forest once stood, and he brings with him peace and tranquility. The sole surviving cedar is found and brought to the vine, which begins to speak to the cedar and accuse it of great wickedness. The cedar is described as an insatiable conqueror, a very haughty ruler, and a terrible oppressor. The vine assigns the cedar to death and continual torment until some future time, when he will return to life only to be tormented again. After the cedar is immolated, the vine rules in peace and light and fills the plain with flowers that do not wither. Baruch obviously can't make heads or tails of the vision, because as soon as he wakes up, he asks Yahweh to interpret the dream. In order to convince Yahweh to grant that request, Baruch reminds Adonai that his life has been dedicated to understanding and walking out the wisdom of the Torah. Thus, he knows from experience that Elohim loves to enlighten his saints. Baruch has positioned himself to receive enlightenment regarding this sacred vision. I think it's important to note here that Baruch was a man of strong faith whose trust moved him to walk out Elohim's instructions. Scripture was his playbook. His faith resulted in right action as defined by Yahweh, not as defined by himself. I pray no less will be said of us. Let's go on to chapter 39 and see how Yahweh responded to his prophet. The plain is the world stage. The forest symbolizes the host of powerful men and establishments that make up an evil empire called the Fourth Kingdom. This Fourth Kingdom will be the last to exist before the coming of Messiah. It will be born out of the ashes of 3 earlier kingdoms, the first of which exists in Baruch's present day. For Elohim says, "Behold, the days come, and this kingdom will be destroyed, which once destroyed Zion, and it will be subjected to that which comes after it." 2 Baruch 39:3. This kingdom which destroyed Zion is the kingdom of the Chaldeans, called Babel or Babylon. If this theme of the Babylonian Empire leading to a fourth, more terrible empire sounds familiar to you, it should. The prophet Daniel foresaw the exact same thing. In a few minutes, we'll take a look at Daniel's dream vision about the 4 kingdoms. Continuing on with the interpretation, we find that this 4th kingdom will persist for a long time and become very arrogant and hide the truth. Evil people will flock to it by nature, and it will shelter them. The vine which rises up over the forest is the Messiah, and it is he who will uproot the trees of the forest at his coming. The one lofty cedar that remains, says chapter 40, verse 1, is the final leader of the 4th kingdom. We know this individual as the Antichrist. He is more properly known as the man of perdition, and the man of lawlessness, and the beast from the abyss. We know that the beast will be a global dictator at the end of the age, primarily because of the testimony of John, who wrote, "These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled." Revelation 17, verses 13 to 17. This final world leader will fight against Messiah but lose badly, and all of his hosts, meaning armies, will be slain, says chapter 40, verse 1. He himself will survive to be taken before Yeshua and judged. Chapter 40 says that the Antichrist will be brought before Yeshua on Mount Zion. Now look back to 36:6 and notice that the vine will come to a place which is not far from where the cedar is staying. Hiding, actually, would be a better term. So the Antichrist will retreat during the last battle, but will still be in close proximity to Jerusalem. This is in fact exactly what we find in Isaiah chapter 31. It's a cryptic passage if you don't know what you're looking at, because it starts out warning the Israelites not to return to Egypt, but it shifts in verse 4 to speaking about the day of Adonai, when Messiah, here called Yahweh of Hosts, will descend to fight in Jerusalem. Who is he going to fight? The Assyrian, which is the Antichrist. We're going to come back to that later and figure out why the beast is called the Assyrian, but for now, look at what happens to him in verse 8. He falls by a supernatural sword, the sword which the book of Revelation says will come out of the mouth of Yeshua, but he is only injured, not killed, because he flees from that sword. According to what we just read in 2 Baruch 36, the Antichrist doesn't retreat very far before being captured and hauled back to Jerusalem for trial. At that trial, says chapter 40, verse 1, all of the sins of the beast and all of the sins committed by the troops under his command will be presented as evidence. The death sentence will be passed and the beast executed. Revelation 19:20 tells us how he will be executed. By, quote, being thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, end quote. This corresponds with the imagery of 2 Baruch chapter 37, verse 1, wherein Baruch sees the great cedar burning. Can you imagine how satisfying that moment is going to be for all the victims of the beast and the kingdom of Babel? When the vine says to the cedar that he will be tormented until the last time comes in which the cedar will come again and be tormented still more, this is a reference to the second resurrection and the great white throne judgment. The Apostle John foresaw that after the 1,000 years of the Messianic age, all of the dead will be resurrected who weren't previously resurrected for the Lamb's wedding, chapter 20, verse 5. This second resurrection includes all of the wicked, and they will be judged before the throne of the Almighty. Then everyone whose name is not found written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death, Revelation 20, verses 14 and 15. The Antichrist will be part of that group of people who are resurrected and judged only to be thrown into another lake of fire. Not the same lake of fire, though. The first is a lake of fire and sulfur. This second is a new lake of fire, because Revelation 20:11 says that heaven and earth will disappear before the judgment. So this must be a different lake of fire. Baruch's dream ends with the vine and everything around it glowing on the plain, which is full of unfading flowers. Those eternal flowers are the resurrected saints who will possess the kingdom with Yeshua. You might be asking yourself, what is this lake of fire into which the Antichrist is thrown? Well, it doesn't exist at the moment. The lake of fire is something that Yeshua will create at his second coming. Let's look at a couple of Bible passages about it. The first is Isaiah 30, which is an oracle about the day of Adonai. And every stroke of the appointed staff that Yahweh lays on them will be the sound of tambourines and lyres. For Topheth has long been prepared. Indeed, for the king it is made ready, its pyre made deep and wide, with fire and wood in abundance. The breath of Yahweh, like a stream of sulfur, kindles it. Isaiah 30, 32-33. This burning place, Topheth, is in the valley of Hinnom, also called Gehenna. Topheth was a location in Jerusalem in the Gehinnom where worshippers influenced by the ancient Canaanite religion engaged in the human sacrifice of children to the gods Molech and Baal by burning them alive. Yes, This valley is where children were burned to false gods. Yahweh spoke of this to the Israelites of Baruch's day when he commanded Jeremiah, "Go out to the valley of the son of Hinnom at the entry to the potsherd gate, and proclaim there the words that I tell you. You shall say, Hear the word of Yahweh, O kings of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the El of Israel, Behold, I am bringing such disaster upon this place that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle, because the people have forsaken me and have profaned this place by making offerings in it to other gods whom neither they nor their fathers nor the kings of Judah have known, and because they have filled this place with the blood of innocents, and have built the high places of Baal to turn their sons in the fire as burnt offerings to Baal, which I did not command or decree, nor did it come into my mind. Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares Yahweh, when this place shall no more be called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter." Jeremiah 19, 2-6. The slaughtered enemies of Yeshua will be thrown into the valley of Hinnom and set on fire in an incredible reversal of the child sacrifices performed there. The Hebrew name Hinnom, when translated into Greek, is Gehenna. After the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile, Hinnom was no longer used for idol worship and child sacrifice, thankfully, but instead became the city dump. Trash from Jerusalem was tossed into the valley and occasionally incinerated. The picture of Gehenna as the place of punishment or destruction of the wicked occurs frequently in the Mishnah and Talmud, but more importantly, Yeshua repeatedly spoke of it in the same terms. For instance, Luke 12:5 reads, quote, "Fear the one who, after he has killed, has authority to cast into Gehenna. Yes, I tell you, fear him." End quote. And in Mark 9, we find a strong warning from Yeshua. "If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed, rather than having 2 hands to go into Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire, where their worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched." Mark 9, 43-44. In that last passage, Yeshua was quoting from the book of Isaiah. Elohim promised through Isaiah that people of all sorts will go to Zion to worship on the Sabbaths and new moons during the millennium, and as they leave the temple, they will look down into the valley and see people burning in Gehenna. I know it sounds almost unbelievable, but that's what the prophecy says. It is written, "For as the renewed heavens and the renewed earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says Yahweh, so your offspring and your name shall remain. It shall happen that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will come to worship before me, says Yahweh. They will go out and look at the dead bodies of the men who have transgressed against me, for their worm will not die, nor will their fire be quenched, and they will be loathsome to all mankind." Isaiah 66, 22-24. The men who have transgressed against Yahweh and been thrown into this open grave, burning with supernatural fire, are the man of lawlessness, his false prophet, his soldiers, and those who have taken his mark. For we read, "Another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a great voice, If anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is prepared unmixed in the cup of his anger. He will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. The smoke of their torment goes up perpetually. They have no rest day or night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name." Revelation 14, 9-11. This is the sad end of everyone who fights against Yahweh. Gehenna will be a stark contrast to the verdant, joyful, and peaceful state of the promised land surrounding it. As great as life during the millennium will be, it won't be perfect, which is one reason that people will need Gehenna as a reminder of where sin leads. Remember that I said in the last lecture that death and sin will still exist during the millennium, and only cease after the 1,000 years when Elohim makes a new heaven and a new earth? Well, chapter 40 verse 3 confirms this when it states that the principate or rulership of the Prince of Peace will stand in perpetuity, uninterrupted until the world of corruption comes to an end. So corruption will still be present during the Messianic age. And for an example of this, see Zechariah 14:17, which says, quote, "If anyone from the families of the earth will not come to Jerusalem to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, there will be no rain for them." End quote. Yahweh made the prophet Daniel famous and influential in Babylon by having him interpret a dream vision that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar. The dream, which none of the Chaldean wise men could understand, pertained to the progression of empires that arose from Babel. In this dream, the king saw a statue of a man made from a variety of materials. The head was gold, the chest was silver, the midsection was brass, the legs were iron, and the feet were half iron, half clay. Daniel was given the interpretation of this night vision. He said that the gold symbolized Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. The silver and brass symbolized kingdoms that would succeed his own. The iron symbolized a fourth kingdom, strong and ruthless, which would eventually become mixed with weak kingdoms symbolized by clay. A stone cut without hands would strike the feet, breaking the entire statue into pieces and grinding it to dust. The stone would then grow into a mountain and fill the earth. Having the advantage of hindsight, we can easily unpack this interpretation. Just as gold is a soft metal, Neo-Babylon was softer than the kingdoms that would follow it, but it was also the most splendid. The silver kingdom, having two arms, was Medo-Persia, which followed Babylon and inherited much of its wealth, but was not as glorious. The brass kingdom was Greece, which was more advanced. Brass is an alloy, and unyielding. The iron kingdom was Rome, which was very strong and merciless, and which was divided east and west like legs. Legs become narrow at the ankles, which tells us that Rome dwindled but never disappeared. In fact, power in large part transferred from the government of Rome to the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church, which both still have huge followings today. The fact that the feet of the statue flare out from the ankles teaches us that both halves of Rome will again grow in power at the end of the age. Its final incarnation will have 10 regions ruled by 10 kings, which is why there are 10 toes on the statue. Yeshua HaMashiach is the stone cut without hands, who will crush the kingdoms of man and take over the entire world during the time of those 10 kings. So, as strange as it may seem, much of the world is still living in the Roman Empire. The fourth kingdom never died, which is why 2 Baruch 39:5 says that, quote, "It will rule many times," end quote, and, quote, "will hold fast for times," end quote. It currently isn't as harsh or evil as it once was, but that will soon change as it grows into the chimeric powerhouse that Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. Now that we understand the interpretation of Baruch's dream from an overarching perspective, let's consider the individual elements. First, the mountains. The mountains could stand for an impassable obstacle, meaning that no one who lives on the plain is able to leave it. If that is the case, then the mountains would represent either the firmament above us or the veil between the celestial and telestial worlds. Another possibility is that the mountains are representative of all of the Earth's literal mountains, while the plain represents the Earth's lowlands, where most of the great civilizations have flourished. Many verses foretell that the literal mountains of the earth will quake so severely that they will fall apart on the day of Adonai. A third possibility, and my preferred option, is that the mountains represent the fallen angelic rulers of this world, Satan and the cosmocrators. They are the lofty ones around us, their substance as tough and immutable as a granite spire, their hearts as hard as stone. Like the mountains of the vision, they will be brought low, and they will be imprisoned in the abyss at the coming of Messiah. Or it could be all of these interpretations at once. Yahweh does seem to enjoy imbuing his word with layers of meaning. One might wonder, why is the Messiah symbolized by a vine? We know that Yeshua said, "I am the vine, you are the branches." But prior to that, Israel had been likened to a vine or vineyard several times throughout the Tanakh. We might recall the words of Hosea, who said that, quote, Israel was a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit, end quote, Hosea 10:1. That fruit represents people who are pleasurable to Elohim because of their faithfulness and righteousness. But then we might also recall the parable of Isaiah 5:1-7, which describes Israel as a vineyard that puts forth only wild grapes, and thus is laid waste by the vintner. Wild grapes represent rebellious individuals, which is why the prophets say that Messiah will tread the grapes of wrath. So at one point in history, Israel did bear good fruit for Elohim, but it later became good for nothing and an object of wrath. The fourth gospel refers to Yeshua as the true vine. The implication is that in contrast to the kingdom of Israel, which became unfaithful and incurred judgment, Yeshua remains faithful and thus fulfills Israel's calling to be the vine of Elohim. Since Yeshua is the king of Israel, we understand that Israel is once again a luxuriant vine that yields good fruit. That fruit being, of course, the members of the invisible kingdom of Messiah, not the apostate Jewish citizens of the modern-day nation called Israel. From under the vine in Baruch's dream goes forth a stream peacefully, says 36:3. That brings to mind what Yeshua told the Samaritan woman at the well. Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst again. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water, springing up to eternal life. John 4:13-14. The fountain from the vine is a stream of life-giving water for those who revere Yahweh, but for those who reject righteousness, the fountain becomes a raging torrent that tears up and drowns, like a massive tsunami that devastates everything in its path. Listen to what Yahweh told Nahum about the day of Adonai. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, yes, the world and all who dwell in it. With an overflowing flood, he will make a full end of her place, and will pursue his enemies into darkness. Chapter 1, verses 5-8. In the last days, the tsunami of Elohim's wrath will come against the kingdom of the beast in a variety of ways, including earthquakes, hailstorms, confusion, and fire, but most notably, in the form of the heavenly army which will follow Yeshua when he returns to tread the winepress. Revelation 19:11-15. This might be a good time to take a short break, because I'm going to need you to turn your thinking caps to full power for this next segment. If you've read Leviathan's Ruse, then you're already familiar with what I'm about to teach, but if not, this information may be a lot to chew on. I'm going to greatly condense this subject matter in order to present it quickly, but I highly recommend getting a copy of my book for more detail. Earlier, I said that the Antichrist is called the Assyrian in the book of Isaiah. Actually, he's called Ashur, or it can be pronounced Assur or Assur, depending on where you come from. But in the West, we generally say Ashur. This moniker is used in other places as well. I'm going to show you some of those references, but first, let me explain why you've probably never heard any teachers use the name Ashur for the man of lawlessness. The following quote from author Peter Goodgame explains that many biblical references to the Antichrist are entirely cloaked from view because of quirks in translation. Modern translators don't truly understand the use of the name Ashur in its biblical historical context, so the singular word Ashur is sometimes translated as Assyria or Assyrians, and often confusingly as the Assyrian. However, the Hebrew text rarely precedes Ashur with the definite article the, and many of the translations are misleading. We should just take the Hebrew word Ashur to mean Ashur, and then let the verb tenses and context determine whether the name is meant to refer to the Assyrian nation, the Assyrian people, the Assyrian king, or the historical figure behind the Assyrians, Ashur himself. That's from The Second Coming of the Antichrist, page 180. A few wise scholars of past generations understood that the Bible uses the name Ashur not only for the nation founded by Ashur, but for the end times enemy of the people of Yahweh. But nearly every modern teaching about the Antichrist completely overlooks this enigmatic figure who first appears in Genesis, then later on in the writings of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and Micah. Goodgame was perhaps the first of our generation to notice and write about the false Messiah, Ashur. Isaiah 30:33 predicts that Ashur will be destroyed by the breath of the Lord at the end of the age. Yahweh will cause his glorious voice to be heard and will show the descent of his arm with the indignation of his anger and the flame of a devouring fire, with a blast, storm, and hailstones. For through Yahweh's voice Ashur will be dismayed. He will strike him with his rod. Every stroke of the rod of punishment which Yahweh will lay on him will be with the sound of tambourines and harps. He will fight them in battles brandishing weapons. Isaiah 30:30-32. But before his destruction, Ashur will be used by Yahweh to bring severe discipline upon the Jewish people because of their rejection of Yeshua. Ashur is the rod of my anger, and the staff in his hand is my indignation. I will send him against a hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him charge, to take the spoil and to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Isaiah 10:5-6. Now you may be tempted to think that this is just about the past event of Assyria attacking and capturing the northern tribes of ancient Israel, but that was indeed the pre-fulfillment of this oracle, not the final fulfillment. Let's keep reading from verse 12. When Yahweh has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of King Ashur, and the boastful look in his eyes. For he says, "By the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding. I remove the boundaries of people and plunder their treasures. Like a bull I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened the mouth or chirped. Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it? As if the rod should wield him who lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who is not wood. Therefore Adonai Yahweh of hosts will send a wasting sickness among his stout warriors, and under his glory a burning will be kindled, like the burning of fire. The light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day. The glory of his forest and of his fruitful land Yahweh will destroy, both soul and body, and it will be as when a sick man wastes away. The remnant of the trees of his forest will be so few that a child can write them down. Isaiah 10:12-19. What do we have here? Isaiah is affirming the dream vision of 2 Baruch 36. The ruler of the forest that Messiah will uproot is none other than Ashur the arrogant, who will turn on the Jews in the last days. Who is the light of Israel spoken about in that passage? It's Messiah. He is the Holy One who becomes like a flame and who devours with fire. This glorious forest of Ashur's will be devastated by Yahweh of hosts, Yeshua HaMashiach, when he comes in glory. Let's look at a couple of other passages concerning Ashur, and then I'll explain how the founder of ancient Assyria could possibly be the Antichrist. Hosea 14:13 prophesies that the descendants of Jacob will repent at the end of the age and confess to Yahweh, saying, quote, "Ashur shall not save us." End quote. Why would they be doing that? It's because Ashur will have been their false Messiah, the anointed one whom Daniel 9:27 tells us will confirm a covenant with the Jews, but betray them after 3.5 years. This is the same covenant spoken about in Isaiah 28, wherein Elohim tells Jerusalem's leaders, "Because you have said, 'We have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it won't come to us. Your covenant with death shall be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it." Isaiah 28:15-18. What does it mean that the Jews will make a covenant with death and the underworld? That statement is utter lunacy, unless you understand that Ashur died thousands of years ago and will be revived in a dark reflection of our Messiah's resurrection. Ashur is biding his time in Sheol. One of his epithets is man of perdition, which means man of total destruction. He conquered the ancient world, and he'll soon conquer the modern one. When he turns on the Jews, that will begin what the Bible calls the time of Jacob's trouble. We can find another passage about Asshur if we turn to the book of Micah. Chapter 5 speaks of both the Messiah and his counterpart in that order. It reads, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, being small among the clans of Judah, out of you one will come out to me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings out are from of old, from ancient times." Micah 5:2. What ruler of Israel came from Bethlehem? It was Yeshua of the tribe of Judah, the Ancient of Days. Let's skip a couple of verses and keep reading. "He will be our peace when Asshur invades our land, and when he marches through our fortresses. He will deliver us from Asshur when he invades our land and when he marches within our border." Micah 5:5-6. The earliest complete extant commentary on the book of Revelation was written by Saint Victorinus of Potovia in the second half of the 3rd century. In his commentary on the 8th chapter of Revelation, he argues from Micah 5:6 that Asshur is the Antichrist. So this is not a new theory. By carefully parsing the book of Revelation, we can be sure that this Asshur has already lived and will return to be the global emperor of the end times. There are two relevant passages. The first is Revelation 13:3, which is about the seven-headed beast that arises from the sea. Quote, "One of the beast's heads looked like it had sustained a mortal wound, but its fatal wound was healed. Wrapped with amazement, the whole world followed the beast." End quote. A very common misconception about the Antichrist is that he will die from a head wound but be healed. But that's not what this verse says. It says one of the heads, plural, will be slain. We are being presented with symbolic imagery in Revelation 13:3. This should be obvious because the beast's form is a combination of the four kingdoms of Daniel 7:8. Revelation 17 tells us that the heads of this symbolic beast are 7 kings. That being the case, the wounding and healing of one of the 7 heads of this chimeric beast must represent the death and resurrection of one of the kings of an empire. That conclusion is staunchly supported by Revelation 17 verses 8-11, which read, "The beast that you saw was, and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and enter perdition. Those who dwell on the earth and whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel when they see that the beast was, and is not, and yet shall be. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is living, and the other has not yet come. When he comes, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is no longer, he is himself an 8th king, but is one of the 7, and he goes into perdition." Revelation 17, 8-11. So the 7 heads are 7 kings who have lived over some period of time, each ruling the secular system represented by this beast from the sea. Whenever John was receiving this vision, king number 6 was still alive and ruling. The first 5, the angel says, had already lived and died by that point. The 7th would arrive sometime later but not stick around for long. And finally, this is the really mysterious part, an 8th king would arise as one of the heads even though there are only 7. How could that be? It's either 7 or 8 kings, right? If it's 8, it can't only be 7. The angel explains this contradiction by saying that the 8th king once was and yet will be. He already lived and was one of the 7 kings of this beast system. Therefore, one of the 7 heads will have 2 lifetimes in which he possesses kingship over the beast system. This is one of the most mind-blowing things you'll find in Scripture. In order to properly understand this whole portion of Revelation, you must understand that there are 2 beasts in view. The first beast is the chimera from the sea, which represents the entire beast system. The second beast is an individual who we call the Antichrist, and he comes from the abyss instead of the sea. The narrative moves back and forth between these 2 beasts in a way that is very difficult to keep up with. That's one of the reasons why the angel said that you must have wisdom in order to understand. The angel reveals to John in verse 8 that the beast who was and is to come, that head that was wounded and healed, would come up out of the abyss and enter perdition. When he died, his soul went to the torment compartment of Sheol, as do all of the wicked. In a previous lecture, I explained that torment is at the depths of the abyss and can only be accessed through the abyss, so the fact that the beast comes up from the abyss means that something will release Ashur's soul from torment and it will ascend out of the underworld. It will then enter into the man of perdition, the reconstructed body of an ancient king. As I said before, if you want more information about who that is, pick up or download a copy of Leviathan's Ruse. That's not a painfully obvious attempt to sell books. It's just a practical matter of not having time in this video to tackle such a complex subject. Ezekiel 31 is the key element connecting our knowledge of Ashur with our knowledge of the lofty cedar in Baruch's dream vision. Ezekiel received a prophecy about Ashur on the first day of the 3rd month of the 11th year of captivity in Babylon, which may seem like extraneous information, but it's not. First, the Book of Jubilees teaches that Noah emerged from the ark and offered a sacrifice on the first day of the 3rd month. Second, Ashur was the king of ancient Babel and Akkad, which later became the Neo-Babylonian Empire that enslaved Ezekiel and the other Jews. So it's incredibly fitting that Ezekiel, living in Nebuchadnezzar's Babel, would get a message about how Ashur became the first man to rule the whole world after the flood. Ezekiel 31 is an oracle addressed to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. At the beginning of the chapter, Yahweh asks Pharaoh the question, "Whom are you like in your greatness?" He then compares Pharaoh to Ashur, using a parable wherein authority figures are represented as trees. We read, "Behold, Ashur was a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches and forest shade, and of towering height, its top among the clouds. Under its branches all the beasts of the field gave birth to their young, and under its shadow lived all great nations." Ezekiel 31 verse 3. As you can see, the imagery used here is the same as that in 2nd Baruch. The lofty cedar of Baruch's vision is the cedar in Lebanon that Yahweh calls Ashur. All of the nations were under its canopy, meaning Ashur ruled the world at that time. We can be sure that Elohim is referring to a man and not the nation of Assyria because, number one, the comparison is being made to Pharaoh, an individual, not a nation, and number two, verse 15 states that upon being killed, the cedar went down to Sheol, which wouldn't apply to a nation, only a man. The lofty cedar became so arrogant and wicked, says Ezekiel 31, 10-11, that Yahweh sent mighty ones, giants, to cut him down. They slew Ashur, and he went to Sheol to join those who are slain by the sword, verse 17. That fact corresponds nicely to Revelation 13:14, which states that the beast had fallen to the sword before being resurrected. There are two questions I would like to address before moving on. Why was this cedar named Ashur planted in Lebanon, and why was he compared to Pharaoh? Although Ashur founded the ancient Mesopotamian cities that became the nation of Assyria, he didn't stay there. He took control of the tribes in the Indus Valley, then followed the Fertile Crescent to Asia Minor, and conquered from there all the way down to Egypt. The hub of his government, though, became Lebanon, where he was worshipped by the Canaanites, also known as Phoenicians. They deified him and called him Baal, which means Lord. In Egypt, Ashur became known as the demigod Osiris. Actually, Osiris is what the Greeks called that Egyptian god-man, but the Egyptians named him Assur. The connection is obvious. Upon inserting vowels into the name Assur, it becomes Ashur, Assar, or Asari of Mesopotamian mythology. The name Asari is written with two ideographs which are identical to the hieroglyphic characters of Osiris's Egyptian name. Those ideographs are a throne and a single eye. Egyptian mythology teaches that Osiris was murdered and his remains were turned into the first mummy ever created. He has become Lord of the Underworld, but the Egyptians expected him to one day return. They role-played his resurrection every year in concert with the rising of the Nile River. Osiris was the first pharaoh of Egypt, but every pharaoh enthroned after him was also considered to be Osiris through magic. The Egyptian priests would imbue each new pharaoh with the spirit of Osiris on coronation day. It made perfect sense for Yahweh to compare Pharaoh with Ashur, because the Egyptians already considered Pharaoh to be the embodiment of Ashur. As we start chapter 41 of 2nd Baruch, Yahweh has just announced to Baruch that the Messiah will triumph over his enemies and establish an everlasting kingdom. Thus, Baruch has begun to meditate upon the Messianic age. Who will be found worthy of entering his kingdom, Baruch wonders? Will there be a weeding out process? Because many Israelites had turned their back on the national covenant and rebelled against Torah. Many, but not all, because Baruch knows that some have forsaken vanity and trusted in Yahweh. Forsaken their vanity, in verse 4, is an interesting phrase. Whenever we imagine we don't need to submit under the authority of the Most High and can instead rely on ourselves, we become vain or arrogant, and our existence becomes futile because we forfeit eternal life. Everyone, of course, gravitates towards vanity because of the dead spirit which we inherited from Adam. So we all have to consciously forsake that way and be born again. There's a whole sermon waiting to be preached from verse 4, but I'll control myself and move on with the lesson. Baruch's last question in verse 6 seems to be formed around the idea that perhaps the degree of punishment for rebellious Israelites at the end of the age will be dependent upon the weightiness of their apostasy. That maybe it's not a binary situation of in or out, but a graded incline. Perhaps some of those Israelites who have strayed will be lesser instead of greater in that kingdom. Yahweh sees fit to answer these questions, and we read his response in chapter 42. Yahweh tells Baruch that it is binary. Those who are righteous will inherit eternal goodness. Those who are wicked will inherit eternal destruction. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't any degrees of blessing or degrees of cursing. We get more rewards for bearing more fruit. But the fact is, we'll never have the chance to get rewards if we aren't found righteous and able to inherit eternal life. To be frank, verses 4 through 6 may be above my pay grade right now. I don't understand what Yahweh is trying to say to his prophet in these verses. Verse 7 I can understand, though. It's a reiteration of the binary nature of people's fates. There are only two ways, the way of corruption and the way of life, a broad gate and a narrow gate. And then verse 8 is referencing the resurrections. The earth will have to give up the dead. From dust we came, and to dust we return, but not permanently. We will all rise, either to eternal life or eternal death. As chapter 43 begins, Yahweh instructs Baruch to meditate on what he's learned and come to a firm understanding of what will occur in the end. Why? Because Baruch will be there as it unfolds. Once again, Adonai tells the prophet that he needs to get ready to leave the world of mortals. Furthermore, after he is taken, he will forget about earthly things, presumably until such time as he is sent back, though that isn't stated. What is stated is that many eternal consolations await Baruch. It is very likely that the original Hebrew word here translated as eternal was the common word olam, which doesn't mean forever and without end, but rather perpetual or age-enduring. That's not to say that there won't be rewards for Baruch in eternity, but in the context of this chapter, it's more likely that Yahweh is telling Baruch that until the end of the age, he will be given rest from all the suffering that he's been experiencing on account of Israel's faithlessness. Baruch will have peace while he's preserved. But Adonai indicates in verse 3 that before Baruch is removed from the earth, there is more to do and more to discuss. Baruch has his marching orders. Go tell his kinsmen about his soon departure, and then do another 7-day fast. Are you starting to get the picture that Yahweh really wants divine revelations to be preceded by a time of self-denial? Fasting is a very important tool for consecration. Your assignment for next time is to read chapters 44 through 49. I'll see you then.